Our text today comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verses 37 through 42. And it reads as follows. It says, "Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." He also told them this parable: "Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher." Verse 41, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take the speck out of your eye,' when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." The word of the Lord. My sermon title today is The Plank Paradox. The Plank Paradox. What is a paradox? Paradox is a situation, person, or thing that combines contradictory features or qualities. Paradox basically points to a contradiction. And what I find paradoxical, brothers and sisters, is that many of us love to critique. We often point fingers. We can easily find fault in others. However, we aren't as quick to do self-reflection and see what areas of need we have in our own life. I've been guilty of this. I can't speak for you, but my assumption is that many of us at any given point in our lives have found it easier to see the fault in someone else and in other people, while not quite taking the time to see what's happening in ourselves and in our hearts. I believe this, in many ways, points to what is happening in chapter 6 in our text today. We see the contradiction, we see the hypocrisy, we see the paradox as it pertains to Jesus' relationship with the Pharisees. If we look over or survey chapter 6 quickly, we see that chapter starts out with the disciples on the Sabbath walking through fields with Jesus. And the text says that they began to grab grain and rub their hands together and eat the grain. And the Pharisees from afar were upset because to them this mirrored work. And they challenged Jesus by saying, "Why do your disciples work on the Sabbath?" When you get down to chapter 6, verse 6, there is another story that has Jesus finding himself in the temple. In the temple, there was a man whose hand was shriveled and deformed. And Jesus made it up in his mind that he was going to heal this man. The Bible also tells us that the Pharisees looked on, waiting to see what Jesus would do because they were looking for a reason to find fault in him. They wanted to be upset with him. Jesus had been doing these marvelous things, and they were threatening. So they were trying to find something that they could hang on him so they could accuse him and criticize him. And Jesus challenges them by saying in chapter 6, he has the man stand up in front of everyone, and then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or destroy it?" They had no response because obviously the answer was to do good, but the text also says that they were upset. They were upset that Jesus on the Sabbath was about to and eventually healed this man who had a deformed hand. At this point, the text tells us that Jesus goes out to the mountainside with his disciples, and many of the other disciples or his followers came out, and he began to teach. They came out because they knew that he had been healing, he had been casting out demons. They were coming to get something from Jesus, and he takes this opportunity to teach. One of the things that stands out to me about this is before they got into who Jesus blessed or healed or restored, we see this long period of Jesus Christ teaching, and it makes me start to consider what the relationship is between understanding who Jesus is and what he would have us do as it pertains to our healing and deliverance. Because I believe, brothers and sisters, that many of us have to fully understand who Jesus is before we can experience the fullness of what he has to give. And so as they are coming to be healed and be delivered and to be free from impure spirits, Jesus looks at his disciples and he begins to teach. And the teaching is very similar to what we see or parallels what we see in Matthew chapter 5 through 7, which is referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. And if you know anything about the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, many of the stories often parallel each other. So it's very likely that the Gospel writer Luke borrowed some of these stories. And so we see him teaching about having love for our enemies, but then he goes down and begins to teach about judgment. The judgment that many of us often give out but don't want to receive. And I think I touched on this a little bit last week of how easy it is for us to point out flaws in others, but don't want to have our flaws pointed out. And so Jesus begins to teach about judgment. And in verse 37, he says this. And the reason why I believe this section is so important, because he wants his disciples to understand that there's a huge contrast between the way that the Pharisees approached their understanding of who God was and the way Jesus approaches that. Brothers and sisters, we see that the Pharisees are very hooked on rightness, making sure that we follow the laws to a T, but Jesus was more concerned with righteousness. And sometimes there is a slight nuance. And so in verse 37, the first thing we see, it says, do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Give and it will be given to you. A good measure pressed down, shaken together and running over will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. The interesting thing is that we've also often used in my background this text as a text about giving. Give and it will be given unto you. For the measure that you give will be measured unto you. Good measure pressed down, shaken together, and running over. But as I look at this text in its full context, what Jesus is doing is basically telling the disciples that you will get out of life what you give. You will get out of life what you give. Here is what I mean. He says, do not judge and you will not be judged. It's pretty simple. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. He is really calling the disciples to be the type of people that we want to experience. In other words, I don't want to be condemned. When I make a mistake, I want to be forgiven. I don't want to be judged because I know that sometimes there's a rationale behind some of the things that I do that might not make sense. I need you to give me a break. In my humanity, I want you to see past what I have done and not judge me. And so what Jesus is saying is something that is very simple. He's saying, listen, I want you to be the type of person to other people that you want to experience. In other words, if you don't want to be judged, if you don't want to be condemned, if you want to be forgiven when you mess up, if you want to be a person that receives blessing and receives goodness, then this is the type of person that you are supposed to be. Now, we know that Jesus was doing this in the earshot of the Pharisees. And so part of what he was trying to do is saying, hey, Pharisees, if you, as religious leaders, want the respect and the reverence and want to see the fruits of being religious leaders, then you have to be different than what you have been. So in a very simple way, Jesus is saying you get out of life what you give. And brothers and sisters, for me, that makes so much sense. But for some reason, we have expectations that we aren't often willing to meet. My wife recently went on this fitness journey. I hope this is not like embarrassing or something. I'm sorry in advance. She went on this fitness journey. She lost like 60 pounds, right? Changed her diet, works out every morning. And every morning when she gets up and I roll over and I see that she's not there, and I'm like, man, I could use 60 pounds. But do I want to work out? Do I want to give up Red Bull? I sure love those cakes and pies that I buy from Walgreens. I have this expectation that my body will respond to what's in my head without me physically putting forth the effort. You get what I'm saying? So we have this expectation that people will just be good to us without us putting out that same energy. Jesus is calling to question the hypocrisy that many of us have, that we want things that we aren't willing to give. We want to see results when we're not willing to put in the work. We want to have great relationships without being the type of people that we will want to be in relationship with. It's like the old adage that says, he who would have friends must first show himself friendly. It seems so simple. Sorry. Yeah. It seems so simple, but I think that we all struggle with it because many of us, thank you. Yeah. Sorry, people at home. No, this is like weird silence. Okay. It seems simple, but I think many of us struggle with it because for many of us, there are things within us that we don't want to face. But I'll come back to that. So Jesus is saying that you get what you give, and the reality is that many of us in the same vein can't even take what we dish. You ever met a person that is so sarcastic, and the minute that you give them a little bit of sarcasm back, why are you looking at the person that's mean, and the minute that you're mean back, they don't know what to do? Jesus is trying to challenge us and wake us up and say, hey, listen, brothers, sisters, my dear Pharisees, my religious leaders, you can't expect to get what you don't give. He's trying to help them go on a journey because what he is hoping that they do is begin to be more considerate or reflective of who they are in the way that they live, because Jesus' disciples are a reflection of him. Jesus' teachers, or the teachers in the temple, are a reflection of God. And this is what the people are seeing. And so then he goes on to verse 39 and he says this. It says, he also told them this parable. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. Well, how does this connect? How does this connect to the above sentences we talked about, giving and not judging and not condemning? And again, we have to remember that this was a direct response to the Pharisees. Right? The Pharisees who he was challenging and saying, listen, as you are judging and condemning and really not being an example of the love of the gospel, you actually are missing the entire point. And so how can you teach something that you don't understand? How can you lead something that you haven't grasped? How could you be the leaders that you're called to be in the temple if you really don't know me? The thing that I take away from this, brothers and sisters, then, is that good leaders must self-reflect and be willing to address their blind spots. Jesus is calling the Pharisees to see the blind spots they have in their approach to the people in order for them to reflect him more fully. Well, what does this mean for us? The reality is that we are all leaders in some way. Some of us are leaders here in the church. Some of us are leaders in our homes. If you are a husband, you're a leader. If you're a wife, you're a leader. If you are a parent, you're a leader. If you're a brother, you are a leader. If you are a believer, there is some place in your life where the way that you live is showing somebody what it means to be a believer. So in other words, like the Pharisees, we must often self-reflect on our own stuff, because how can I lead effectively if I don't know where I'm going? How can I lead effectively if I haven't taken the time to see and reflect on the things that make me who I am and make me respond how I respond? Jesus is calling out the fact that the Pharisees' blindness to their own hypocrisy often led them to lead people astray. And he is now challenging them and saying, listen, everyone who gets to know me and be shaped and formed by me can be like me, though they'll never surpass me. And I think that this is part of what Jesus was doing when they were trying to challenge, because you often see the Pharisees try to challenge Jesus. They try to catch him up. They always thought that maybe they were smarter than him, that they had found something in the law that they could use to overpower him and rightfully condemn him. And he always had a response. Instead of trying to beat Jesus and find a reason to accuse him, he is challenging them to say, follow me, be like me, and in being like me, maybe you'll get the response that you want. And I think that's something that we have to challenge ourselves with, brothers and sisters. Because oftentimes, the lack of self-reflection puts us in dangerous positions because we respond in dangerous ways. When I come home and I'm yelling at Ryan, is it really something that Ryan did? Or is it something that I brought in with me from the outside that I'm taking out on her? When I'm watching things on the news and I'm ready to judge whatever is happening, whether it's the anchor that I'm judging or the story that I'm developing feelings about, is it really me responding to what I'm hearing, or is there something in my heart that I need to submit to Jesus and allow him to shape my understanding? Brothers and sisters, we need to self-reflect. But I know self-reflection is hard. I've said that twice. I'll say it one more time before I dive into that. But there's one more thing that I want to point out. In verse 41, it says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take the speck out of your eye,' when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Jesus takes it one step further and rebukes those who refuse to self-reflect. And he does it in such a strong and powerful way because what he is saying is if you actually do some self-reflection, what you'll realize is while you're trying to point out a speck, there's a plank. That while you're trying to point out the imperfection in somebody else, there's so much imperfection in you that it doesn't even compare. So again, to this self-reflection piece. Why are we so afraid to self-reflect? Now, I know that this isn't an all-encompassing answer, but as I reflected on this, I started asking myself, what things keep me from self-reflecting? One of the things I came up with is that sometimes self-reflection, we are afraid to self-reflect because we don't want to think about the things that we have done. If I self-reflect, I have to begin to think about the mistakes I've made, the times that I've failed, the times that I've fallen short, the things that I've done wrong. If I self-reflect, I'm often faced to look at myself in the mirror, and sometimes, even though I'm very attractive, I don't like what I see. Self-reflection is hard. And maybe it's not just me thinking about the things that I have done, but it's the things that I haven't done. The times where I should have said I was sorry. The times where I should have stepped up. The time where I should have been better. The times where I should have been an advocate. The times where I should have helped and I didn't. And so it's not just thinking about the things that I have done that maybe I'm ashamed of, but it's also thinking about the things that I haven't done that I should have. But here is the other thing about self-reflection. Because it's not just us wading through or working through the things that we have done. It's also sometimes reflecting to or through the things that have been done to us. Sometimes reflecting on the times that we have been hurt. The times where we have been let down, the times where we have been disappointed, the times where other people falling short have affected my life, the times where other people's sins and shortcomings have done damage to me. And sometimes it's easier to just go on and move forward and act as if nothing has ever happened, to put on a brave face and pretend like I'm okay. Sometimes self-reflection is also having to deal with the ways that I've been hurt and offended. And I don't want to deal with that either. But brothers and sisters, what I have realized in my relationship with Jesus Christ is that I am neither completely just the things that I've done, and I'm not just the things that have happened to me. That the reality, brothers and sisters, is that who I am is some weird combination of both. The things that I've experienced in my life, the joys, the sadnesses, the ups, the downs, the disappointments and the celebrations, the failures and the triumphs, that all of those things make up who I am. And when I self-reflect, then maybe I can see those things more fully. Sometimes the fear of self-reflection is the fear of self-condemnation, and it's easier for us to look at others than it is for us to look at ourselves. But the beauty, I believe, of the birth of Jesus Christ, the beauty that I believe comes from the reconciliation that Jesus Christ's life brought to us, is that Jesus can look at the sum of those parts and see something beautiful. I believe the most important thing about being called to self-reflection is not so I can reflect on self and then point out my flaws and start pointing out other people's. I believe it's for me to self-reflect, to see how much Jesus Christ loves me, to see the things that he has forgiven me for, to see that he sees me as whole and beautiful and imperfect and covered in his blood. And when I have that realization, I look at other people differently. Because when I began to look at the ways that Jesus has forgiven me and blessed me and not judged me, I can't help but show people that same grace. I can't help but show people that same love. I can't help but want for people to experience the love and healing that comes with knowing that God loved us so much that he sent his son to reconcile us to himself so we didn't have to bear the shame of sin and hurt and the damage that we experience. So when we self-reflect, what self-reflection should really cause us to do is to reflect on how good God is. Because even though this happened to me, it didn't end me. Even though I did this and I made these mistakes, but God, you also used me to do this. And so I'm not just all the bad things that I've done, and I'm not just all the bad things that have happened to me, but God, I am an imperfect person that you have used as the vessel to be a light in this dark world. Pulling the plank out of my eye doesn't give me a clearer view to see the speck in my brothers, but it gives me a clearer view to see Jesus' presence in my life. Jesus is calling us to self-reflect, to remove the plank so that we can see him more clearly. And then seeing him more clearly, be more thankful, to be more grateful, to be more like him. Let's pray.